Hi everybody, it's Pastor Jesse and this is Pursuing the Point. Today we're looking at a point from a recent message that I have, and the point was a community allows for expressed emotions. Communities have to allow the people that live within them to express their emotions. And I think this really relates to emotional health. Emotional health is quite important to us as human beings, but it isn't something that's talked about enough in the church. And why do people not talk about it? I think there are numerous reasons why people don't talk about it, especially when it comes to mental health. But I think the answers that help people it may be too scientific or secular based. And so Christians might throw those out thinking that they're too much secular or scientific. Also, I think some people see a lack of mental health or needing to work on emotional health. It can be a lack of faith. Some people believe that you don't have enough faith if it's something that you have to work on. Some even see it as satanic or spiritually based or a satanic attack. And I'm not saying that those things don't happen and those things aren't out there, but I don't think that's the reason for all mental health or the need for emotional health. Christians, like most people, just don't want to talk about it in general. I don't think human beings really want to talk about it. It might seem like it's too vulnerable, putting yourself out there. But as Christians, we need to be emotionally honest people. In the book of Ephesians, Paul talks about this. Ephesians 4:13 through 16. He writes this, "Till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to be a perfect person, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about every wind of doctrine, but by the trickery of men, in the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth, may love grow in all things into him who is the head, Christ. From him the whole body joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective work by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love." And in that text, he brings out various things. One is speaking the truth in love, which we as Christians like to focus on that one. But we do that so that we may grow up in all things into him. We actually speak the truth into love for spiritual growth so that we become closer to Christ and more like him. Now, there are main components of this passage. There's the speaking the truth, which I mentioned, but there's also the love. There is growth and maturity. And lastly, there is being Christ-like. So I want to look at some of these quickly because spiritual growth and maturity is what primarily this video is about. But in order to have spiritual maturity, we must have a plan for growth. We must have a spiritual formation, if you will, because without a plan, we really aren't that serious about maturity or about growth. So at this point, I want you to pause the video and here's question number 1. How do you define spiritual maturity? How is spiritual maturity defined by you? Go ahead and take a moment and reflect. Next, I want to look at the different facets of spiritual formation. Now, there are 3 main facets of spiritual formation. There's the experienced biblical foundation. There is the integration of human dimensions. And lastly, there is the process for life application. So these are the 3 things. I only want to focus on one of those today, and that's the integration of the human dimensions. We all know that we are different dimensions. We're multi-dimensional, so to speak. We know in the Great Commandment that Jesus says to the guy who asked the question, he says, body, soul, and spirit. We love the Lord our God with our body, our soul, our spirit. And other versions say heart, the mind, and our strength. But all of these things, especially the mind, which is our intellect, we have to love the Lord. But we must also love him with our heart, which is the fount of our emotions. So Jesus even tells us and shows us that we are multi-dimensional human beings. And there are a variety of dimensions that we have. One is social. We're very social beings. Intellectual, spiritual, and of course, physical. And then lastly, the one I want to focus on today, emotional. So social, intellectual, spiritual, physical, and emotional. In order to have spiritual growth, we need to have spirit grow. I think that's obvious, but our emotional health is directly connected to our spiritual growth and our maturity. Therefore, it's important that we seek healing and growth both emotionally and spiritually. When someone experiences growth in their lives, not only do they benefit from that growth, but really the whole church benefits from our spiritual growth as individuals. It's important to love the Lord with your thoughts, with your spirit, and with your emotions, all integrated in this dimension that we have, the multi-dimensions, all integrated, making us a whole being when it comes to loving the Lord. So now we're at the second question. The second question is, how do you benefit from having the integration of your human dimensions? How do we benefit when we integrate all of the human dimensions that we have? Take a moment and reflect on this question. Lastly, I want to look at emotional unhealth because I think it's important that we identify emotional unhealth, especially as a Christian being involved with a church. We can actually become unhealthy in these ways. So I want to break it down to three parts. The first is emotional health when it comes to God, emotional unhealth when it comes to people, and lastly, ourselves. So I'm going to ask these questions quickly. You may have to pause it and reverse a little bit so you get them all, but let's look at some emotional unhealth when it comes to God. Are we using God to run from God? Are we more interested in God activity? Are we more interested in being busy with the things of God that we don't actually turn to Him, that we don't actually go to Him? Doing for God instead of being with God? Do we take more time doing things for Him rather than being with Him? And dividing our lives. This is another sign of emotional unhealth. Dividing our lives into sacred and secular. Do we divide those things, sacred and secular? That's what we can do for God. Now let's look at for other people. Some signs of emotional unhealth for other people. Dying to the wrong things. Now, dying to the wrong things. Not necessarily physically, of course, but spiritually. Are we dying for the wrong causes? Dying for the wrong things? Spiritualizing away conflict. Do we avoid conflict? Do we avoid talking to people about things, especially our emotions and our health and our emotions? Do we spiritualize it rather than actually deal with it? Do we judge other people's spiritual journey more harshly than we look at our own? Those are three signs of unhealth in people. Now let's look at within ourselves. Are we living without limits? Are we ignoring the emotions of anger, sadness, and fear because those things are not of God? Do we deny the past's impact on our present? Are we covering over brokenness, weakness, and failure? Are we just ignoring it? Are we covering it over, sweeping it under the rug? Now, these 10 things, I want to give credit where credit is due, come out of a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pastor Peter Scazzaro. It's a very good book. I highly recommend it and something that you could look at to help with your emotional health. But as we are looking at identifying the areas, I want to have this quote by Dallas Willard. Spiritual formation in the tradition of Jesus Christ is the process of transformation of the inmost dimension of the human being, the heart, which is the same as the spirit or will. It is being formed, really transformed, in such a way that its natural expression comes to be the deeds of Christ done in the power of Christ. So at this moment, I'd like us to pause, reflect on that. You may want to go back and listen to that again because it really talks about the integration of all the dimensions of a human being. But I want to ask question number 3. In what areas around you, or even in your own life, do you see emotional unhealth? Pause this video and take some time to reflect. And lastly, I want to look at creating a plan, creating a growth plan. If we don't have a plan to grow, we won't. It doesn't just happen in the natural. Our physical does. We physically grow, we intellectually grow, but spiritual growth only comes from sharpening. This is when Scripture talks about iron sharpening iron, which is why we need to grow with other people present and to see these other things. These are all different parts that help us in spiritual growth, but we have to come up with a plan. We have to come up with something that helps us to spiritually grow. One of the things that we can look at when it comes to spiritual growth is learning from history, not necessarily being stuck in it, not having a desire to go back to it, but using history in our own spiritual walk, in our own spiritual growth, to then promote spiritual growth in the future. So I would highly recommend that you go and you get a journal, that you get someplace, or maybe even just write it out on your computer, but somewhere that you write down a plan. List things that you need to change. List things that the Lord has been saying to you, and maybe you need to take some time and really reflect that so that you know those things, but take some time to really look at that and say, this is something that I need to work on. This is something that I need to do. Write it down. A growth plan must be written. Secondly, it must be reviewed. You must look back over it. You must look back at it and say, these are the things that I'm looking at. These become your metrics, almost your measurement. But if you don't review it, if you don't look back, you will forget. We as human beings have a tendency to forget history. That's why it needs to be written. That's why it needs to be reviewed. But it also must be referenceable. It must also be something that we can reference to help us in the future. Not just reviewed and look at, but it has to be on hand. One of the things that I do when I have a goal, because I don't work on a lot of goals at once. I only work on one goal at a time. If you have so many goals, it becomes very difficult for us to actually do all of those and remember all of those. So I will come up with one goal that I need to focus on. Sometimes that takes a full year. Sometimes it doesn't. But I look at that and I write it down. I review it, and then I keep it so it's referenceable in that way. A place where I have emotional unhealth, or a place where I feel like the Lord is working on in my spiritual formation. So these are some of the places, and this is some of the things that I think that we need to look at and really focus on even more. Because as a community, we do need to focus on the emotions that we not only have, but that on others that have around us. It's one of the things that I think is really not looked at enough in a church, is how our emotions all lock, how we do sharpen each other. And I think in this time, we're actually avoiding those things a lot more than we are facing them head on, which is a sign of emotional unhealth. We need to focus on the honesty, and we need to look to the Lord to say, help us in these things, help us in this way. So take some time after this video, and I want you to focus on creating a plan, one that is written, one that you can review and reference it when you have these things.